everyone. It's a gray day here in Martha's Vineyard, and I'm just in the old studio in the basement, where I make my music and where I often will record my studies and all that stuff. But anyway, my morning musings today center around a question that was posed to me this morning by someone very near and dear to me. Sent me a video by a fellow named Elon. Oh, I forget his last name. Golad. I'll have to double check. I can show you the link to the video in the description. But this fellow was perpetuating a trope I've heard over and over and over again, which is this claim that Paul of Tarsus was the real founder of Christianity. And Jesus wasn't. So there's so many different versions of this trope. It's an old one, and there's different forms of it, which are like recent old, and then there's forms of it which are like ancient old. I mean, one of the versions that I was kind of uh, spiritually brought up with when I was a seeker and watching and reading New Age material, and reading like the Rudolf Steiner school, Madame Blavatsky school stuff, is this idea that there was an original Christianity uh, founded by Jesus, which was more esoteric, but that, Saul of Tarsus, Paul sort of co opted it and made it this kind of more Jewish thing. And then there's another version of it, which is like Christianity is this more Jewish thing, but Paul made it this more Greek thing, this more Hellenized thing. And then there's another version of it, which is Jesus was never real, they say, but Paul sort of invented him out of thin air in order to start this cult, which is sort of what Simon the Samaritan actually did, by the way, historically. And some people say that for Paul, like Christ was actually just like a cipher for Paul himself, so he was like actually worship with me. That's one version of this crazy idea. um, there's so many other versions of this trope, but the trope being shared in this video by Elon, what's his face? I'm so bad with names. I'm sorry. Again, I'll link to it after this video is uploaded. The trope that this guy is sharing is that Jesus originally, founded Jewish Christianity, uh, and had his, closer Jewish disciples around him, carrying that tradition on in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem church. That would include Peter, James, and John. And that Paul was this more Hellenized Jewish figure who was, more eager to convert people to the Christian religion, and he didn't want them to have to go through the hoops of obeying the Jewish law. So he said, you don't have to get circumcised, you don't have to follow the ceremonial laws. We're going to get rid of all that. Basically, it's a cheaper religion, that you don't have to pay such a high price. And this guy Elon goes on to say that there was this kind of like conflict between Paul and the Jerusalem church, or the Jewish Christians, which is, this is all like two truths and a lie, right? Like there is a certain conflict that happens, and Paul is involved, but it's this trope is just so old and tired and exaggerated, and I feel bad that our society has gotten to the point that these ideas can be thrown around so easily and never questioned. So let's talk about that. We've talked about the tropes about how Paul supposedly founded Christianity. Let's just talk in summary about how Christianity was actually founded. And this is a combination of what's in the Bible, but it's also including things that we know about who the Hebrews were, who the Jews were, what Hellenization really was. Um, so let's provide a little background first, about what Christianity is and what Judaism is, because one of the foundational ideas of this trope is an anachronism that involves what Judaism is. So when Jesus was teaching, in the, and this is recorded in the Synoptic Bibles and outside of the Synoptic Gospels and other writings from the first and second century, which is all to say there's a lot of sources talking about this. Um, he had doctrinal differences, pretty sharp differences, with two groups in particular, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Uh, and in AD 70, in the first century, Annus Domini 70, Jerusalem, Judea, this region, it was terrorized by war, and Jerusalem was destroyed. Only the Pharisee sect survived this because the Sadducee sect was associated with the temple, and the temple went up in flames. It was destroyed during this Jewish war, which you can hear all about it from Josephus, from Tacitus, etc. A pretty well documented historic event. So the Sadducee sect disappeared because it had congregated around the temple. Um, so this is kind of like Jesus' enemy one group gone by that time. The second group that he criticized, the Pharisees, they survived. They went on to found what we know is rabbinic Judaism, which is to say the Judaism that we've inherited today. The beginning of that tradition, it was the Pharisees, so to speak, because there is no Sadducean Judaism today, right? There are other parties floating around that are very interesting, such as the Essenes and the Nazareans, who intersected to a certain degree, and that's important because these sects are mentioned. The Essenes are known as Israelites. They call themselves Israelites in the Bible. And then there's the Nazarenes or the Nazorians, which you also read about in the Bible. So the Christians were called Nazarenes, known as Nazorians. Paul in Acts, I think it's Acts 24, when he goes before Felix to trial, Paul is called a ringleader of the Nazarenes. So, why is that important? Because the Nazarenes, the etymology of that word, Nazarene or Nazorians, Nazar is branch, and also there's an overlapping meaning that has to do with the concept of preservation, preserving the branch. Or shall we say, like the true branch. And Jesus says, "I'm the vine; you are the branches." So this is the idea that this is the community, the true community of God, preserving the true teachings of the Hebraic spiritual inheritance. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are a great treasure in this regard because they carry on a lot of these ideas, and you dip into the Dead Sea Scrolls and realize, oh, they thought that they were carrying on the true traditions. And most likely, John the Baptist emerged from the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll community, and most likely there was an overlap with the Nazarene community, because the Nazarene community seemed to have basically been Essenes that embraced Christ. The Essenes that did embrace Christ most likely went on to become the Mandaeans, who to this day regard John the Baptist as their founder and their messianic figure, and not Jesus. Okay, so this is some of like the background info. Okay, so there's sectarianism in the origins of Christianity, no doubt, but this is all to address the anachronism, the foundational fallacy, which is that when we talk about Jesus founding a Jewish Christianity and there being a Jewish church, Jewish in this case cannot mean the Judaism which was founded by the Pharisee sect surviving the destruction of Jerusalem, because that existed long after the time of Jesus. So when we talk about Jewish Christianity, what we're really talking about is pre-rabbinic Judaism. That's what we mean by Jewish and Jewish Christianity. And even that is sort of, it's not necessarily the right word for everything that people want to refer to when they're saying Jewish Christianity. And the reason I say that is because there's also this idea that everyone, all the people groups who are the main characters in the Old Testament, there's this idea that they're all Jews, but they weren't. Specifically speaking, being very careful with our language, the term Jew refers to Judeans. So this is like a regional tribe. So when they're talking about the church that's in Judea or the church that's in Jerusalem, You can refer to them as the Jewish Christians because it's like a regional designation, right? Um, but at that time, it was a little more complex because the Pharisees and the Sadducees basically were creating like a monopoly on what they considered to be Judaism because they considered the Judeans, that group, to be the remnant promised by the prophets after the return from exile. So, is Israel as a united kingdom was long gone. Um, the kingdom of David was a very large kingdom, and it split into north and south with Judea in the south, and an even smaller remnant emerged from the political conflicts that preceded the time of Christ. And there's this idea that there would be a chosen remnant that kind of promised by God through the prophets, and it would be of the tribe of Judah. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, uh, they all believed that they were that remnant for various reasons. The Pharisees sort of put an emphasis on the ethnic side of that, and they had a very philosophical approach to the laws of Moses, and therefore they were naturally very legalistic. The Sadducees only believed in the five books of Moses, so they didn't go outside of that to the prophets, and therefore they didn't believe in things like the resurrection, which was foretold by the prophets. So the Sadducees were, um, I don't want to say conservative, but they had a very limited conception of what Judaism should be. Um, and then the Essenes had a much broader scriptural tradition, um, with the Enochian tradition, the writings of Enoch, and they had their own righteous teacher of righteousness that was most likely their founder around the time of Judah Maccabee. Um, and they have all those writings, and so they had what Josephus said was a living prophetic tradition. They had prophets. It was a school of prophets, which is why people think that John the Baptist probably emerged from the Dead Sea community, the Qumran community, aka the Essenes, because the Pharisees didn't have prophets, the Sadducees did not have prophets, the Essenes did, and John the Baptist was a prophet. Okay, so if Christ is being heralded by someone who's most likely an Essene, uh, then it makes sense then that when John uh, also points his disciples Andrew and Philip towards Christ, and John starts pointing his followers, who are also probably Essenes, toward Christ, then there's going to be like a large Essene presence. There are also zealots, like Simon Zealot, who followed Jesus Christ. The zealots were probably also Essenes on some level, or sympathizers, because the Essenes really talked a lot about this great climactic war um, at the end of the Old Covenant history, that would be brought about as vengeance for the crimes against the prophets and the crimes against Melchizedek, the Messiah. Melchizedek just means King of Righteousness. That's Jesus. So, all right, that's the background. Okay, so that explains a little bit like who Jesus was, who his people were, where they were coming from, and that explains how once they became Christians, they were called Nazarenes, which is to say they were preservers, they were conservatives of a more ancient tradition that was not purely limited to Judah, right? So this remnant of the Jews that is promised. Paul himself explains like this isn't purely ethnic. He talks about like, spiritual Jews, right? He says a true Jew is one who in the spirit is obedient to God through faith in the Son of God, in Jesus. So that's how these people, the Nazarenes, interpreted the prophecies and promises to this righteous remnant who would follow the Son of God and be his people. So that's problem one with this view that Paul somehow was selling something other than Jewish Christianity. Actually, that's not true. He was selling something other than Phariseeism, which is true. He was he was a defector from Phariseeism. He was a Pharisee himself, and he says, they got a lot going for them, but they're wrong on a number of things. They're innovators of traditions of man. That's a charge from Jesus Christ himself. That they innovated these man-made traditions that are not what God ordered or wanted in the life of a holy person. So one could say that the Pharisees, are basically the progressives of their time and place, and the Nazarenes or the preservers are conservatives. But what they're conserving is a more ancient history that's more inclusive of the other tribes of Israel, which is why Jesus says, "I'm sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Right? So he's saying, I'm not just collecting the Jews. I'm not just collecting these like elite Jews that the Pharisees think are the righteous remnant promised by God, but I'm getting all the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then I'm going to send the apostles out beyond that to gather the nations. Because long before the days of the Pharisees, long before the talk of the righteous remnant was ever uttered out of the mouths of the prophets, God talks about being the God of all nations in the book of Genesis, etc. So there's so much background here that I wish more people knew about, um, and these tropes about Paul founding Christianity have been around for a while. So some of them started with the Talmud, with the rabbinic Jewish how do I put it, interpretation and tradition, like the way they interpreted scripture, um, did not allow them to accept Christianity. In fact, rabbinic Judaism in many ways is a reaction against Christianity, because that was just such a popular and ascendant movement in the first century. And so, you know, from the rabbinic perspective, I'm trying to be balanced and fair to how we say this. From the rabbinic perspective, Christianity is a heresy of Judaism. From the Christian perspective, rabbinic Judaism is a heresy of Christianity, and actually Christianity is the ancient tradition that goes all the way back to Adam. Like, if we're going to be objective about it, technically speaking, just like in terms of the unfolding of history, Christianity has the advantage in that argument, because rabbinic Judaism was sort of a Reformation movement and a reaction to Christianity. And even the rabbinic Judaism, which developed after the fall of Jerusalem, was different. Founded as it was by the surviving sects of Pharisees, it was still different from the Phariseeism that preceded it, because there were aspects of Pharisee teaching that were right, true, and good, and allowed the Pharisees to believe in Christ, such as like Nicodemus, right? And so there's a lot of scholarship on this fact about how the early, the Talmud attacked Christ and the Christians, one of which was this slander against Paul, that he was basically trying to Hellenize people, or like pull people away from the traditions of Judaism, and pull them away from circumcision, pull them away from the law of Moses. Um, but that requires as a premise that people are supposed to be faithful to the law of Moses, and this comes back to the idea of a conflict between Paul and the so-called Jewish church. Um, the way this conflict played out it culminates in Acts 15, where the Jerusalem church, the Jewish church, lays out a decree, sends it out. Peter and James, particularly James, say, okay, yeah, Christians do not have to get circumcised. They don't have to follow the law of Moses. They should just, avoid meat with blood in it, avoid idols, avoid fornication, adultery, etc., avoid murder, right? Avoid the basics. This was the ruling of the Jewish church. So the idea that this was all Paul's doing is absurd, at least as far as the biblical record goes. And there are historians that back this up. Um, the turning away from circumcision, the turning away from the law of Moses, that was decisively and explicitly decreed by the Jewish church, not Paul. Paul wasn't some renegade. Paul had to deal with this conflict. He was called in to help testify about what God was doing in the Gentile churches, and he was called in as a witness, basically, to support Peter, who received the ministry to the Gentiles first, and who authorized Paul to do it. Which is why Peter's the one who stands up and says, "Y'all remember that I was called by God to be the minister to the Gentiles and to be the first among you to preach Christ to the Gentiles and bring them in to this fold, and let's not trouble them with these laws and all this stuff." So the Jewish church was the one spearheading this. Okay. And yes, there was conflict. Of course, there was conflict. But you have to remember that the Jewish church, according to the book of Acts, these guys were hanging out in the temple, okay? And they were actively preaching, like St. Stephen did, that the temple was going to be destroyed as a fulfillment of all these prophecies that they knew full well about, which is why they accused Jesus of saying that he was going to pull it down. And he never denied it, by the way, nor did St. Stephen in his testimony. They all said this temple is coming down, and you've got to get with Jesus. And that's all to say that they were all hanging out with temple folk. They were hanging out with Sadducees. They were hanging out with Pharisees. This was not like an isolated Christian group that was separate from these figures. So these conversations were happening. There were these Jewish people, right? Like Peter was Jewish, James was Jewish, Paul was Jewish, and they're hanging out with other ethnic Jews, and they just all had different opinions. But to claim that Paul had a different opinion from Peter and James is just incorrect. What they were really dealing with was the fact that there was a communion at that time between the Christians, and the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the Pharisees and Sadducees were trying to have their say and say, okay, well, if it's the Messianic times, if Jesus is the Christ, right? Because they stand up and say, if this is of God, let's not bother them too much. He said, then that means that we're all a single community in Christ, but at least circumcise the men, right? Because there was a precedent for that already. There were proselytes, and Gentile men would become welcomed into the Jewish communities. They would become circumcised and all this stuff. So that's what they were dealing with. They were dealing with people who were not per se Christian in the same way that we would think now, but they were sympathizers, and this was all one community. So that's point one. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we can touch on. I mean, the whole phenomenon is great. There's actually a great article by Dr. Taylor Marshall, who just sort of tongue-in-cheek lampoons all these claims about Paul, because it's like some claim that Paul is this liberator of women, and others claim that he's like a total misogynist. Others say that he's too Jewish. Others say that he's too Hellenistic. Some say that he, was friendly with certain sects of Christianity. Like they say that he was a Gnostic, and then others say that he was explicitly fighting against the Gnostics. So these things could be read from so many angles. I mean, I always say that I can't fault anyone for getting confused about how to interpret these things, but I can fault fellows like Elon, such and such, who made this video, which I think is very disingenuous, and relies on people having never read the Bible and not knowing anything about the history of Christianity too and what's claimed there. I'm gonna say, here we are. Yeah, I mean, I think I covered all the bases, and I always hesitate. Like, I know I'm a guy who does not have a theology degree. I mean, I got out of music school with a passion for ministry and theology, but I didn't have the money to back it up, so I kind of vowed I wouldn't go to seminary, knowing too that a vow to ministry is essentially a vow to poverty. Like, why do you think I ask for donations? So I understand full well, my credibility on this issue is not backed up by degrees, and perhaps this man's is. I don't know. I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying his viewpoint is unfortunately very well represented even in academia, Even though that the volume of scholarship contradicts this position. It's crazy. There's the current state of academia is, I think a lot of you would agree, especially if you went to college recently. It's very sad. Um, Novelty kind of scratches the itch of the itchy ears, as they say, and new ideas are a currency for cachet and being cool. Um, so there's no end to the new quote unquote new ideas that are being churned out in academia. But what's unfortunate is that the sheer volume of scholarship that's been done on many subjects, let alone this one, they're frankly ignored because there's this pervading sense of postmodernism, which says, well, our forebears didn't grow up in a world like ours, which is so new and different and full of innovation and information and enlightenment and technology. They surely could not have known what they were talking about. As opposed to like the Solomon view, which is there's nothing new under the sun. Every one of these ideas has been expressed and thought through by other people before, just with different words. That's the subtlety of all this. So that's why I say this idea that Paul founded Christianity and not Christ. It's somewhat recent and somewhat popular in academia, but on the other hand, you know, it was a trope that started in the second century and kind of subsisted in different parts of the culture. Um, and it, to be blunt, it was sort of stamped out of existence during the height of Christendom, especially by the Catholic Church. Um, but during the Reformation, the world has changed so much. Like these conversations started coming up again. These old heresies started, um, coming back. It's super interesting. I mean, if you look at the doctrinal differences in all the Protestant sects, they all have different names, but you can actually find all of those doctrines discussed, whether heresy or orthodoxy, in the first 3 centuries of the Christian Church. The heresies are obviously the more troubling one because a lot of these heresies were argued for and against and settled, and blood was shed sometimes, but the point is the conversations were had and then things were resolved in the first couple centuries of the church, and now they're just coming back because the memory is so short. The volume of scholarship and documentation about these conversations uh, is being ignored because people are just kind of starting over because of this, post Reformation, post Enlightenment, uh, modernist, postmodernist attitude we have, where we feel like, for good reason, we all want to have our own empirical experience of reality and make up our own minds about things, which is great. It's true, but it the, it leads us to have this attitude that I have to be the first and last to learn the truth about all this stuff, and so we're very suspicious of traditions for that reason. Even though a lot of people thought the same things as us, and went their whole lifetimes and several generations handling these ideas that we're just thinking for the first time. All right, so that's like the postmodern era, the idea that we are completely alienated in our times from the experience of humanity before us in the pre so-called modern era. It's not true. No matter how far out technology gets. um, I mean, the height of our concerns now about AI and all this stuff are that we're in a simulation, epitomized in the Matrix trilogy view of reality. That is, as sci-fi as that is an ancient idea anyway, like Plato's cave and whatnot. So, did Paul found Christianity? No. I mean, insofar as Christianity was, of course, founded by Jesus Christ, Paul is not the founder of Christianity. And anyone who says otherwise is lying or just kind of ill informed. However, I'll give Elon Gilad this. Paul did found churches throughout throughout the Orient, and it got as far as Spain allegedly. He founded tons of churches, and he was a founder of Christianity in these areas. He didn't innovate the doctrines; he carried them. Um, yes, he encountered Jesus and all this stuff and saw him. He didn't get never claimed to get these doctrines supernaturally. He always claimed to be carrying a apostolic tradition. He conferred with the disciples, the apostles, to make sure that he wasn't running in vain, meaning he made sure that he was catechized so that he wasn't offering false catechism. Um, and then in his writings, he explicitly rails against the idea that he should be called the founder of the church or the leader of the church simply because he was the one who evangelized, which is to say, I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I forget which book, but he's talking about, the people who align with Apollos versus aligning with Peter versus aligning with him and Paul. And he's saying, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God, gave the growth, right? He said it doesn't matter who planted the seed of the gospel, who preached it first in the area. It doesn't make the church that person's founding, even though from a historic point of view, sure, so yeah, sure, like, I'm Paul. Like I get why you want me to be your leader. I get why you want this to be the church of Paul, right? Because I was the source of the gospel and I was your teacher and I was your father in the faith. He acknowledges all that, but he says it's still God's church. It's still the church of Jesus Christ. He says all that. Okay, and so that is why Paul was not the founder of Christianity. Like it's one of the grandest conspiracy theories, um, and it's fun to dig into. It's fun to think about because when you actually get into the facts, the historical facts, it actually leads you through information that is very actually edifying for your faith because you learn about the three different communities that Josephus talked about. You learn about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes, and and the relationship that those groups had with figures like John the Baptist and Jesus Christ, what they believed, what they taught, and then you start to understand Christianity more, and you're like, oh, that's why they thought that. That's why they used those books. So it's very interesting that the Dead Sea Scrolls just turned up recently. We didn't have them for thousands of years, and then 100 years ago, we're able to look at these things and see what the scriptures actually said, because we're not relying on the Masoretic text, which was a translation of the Bible, Hebrew translation of the Bible, by people who did not believe in Christ. So there were little alterations there, according to their hermeneutic, which precluded a fulfillment in Jesus. And we read these translations in our own Bibles, by the way, especially if you have a 66 book canon, Protestant one, but even the 73 book Catholic canon sometimes uses the Masoretic. But the point is, we read some of these prophecies and wonder, like, oh, that's weird. How did they get to Jesus from that? That's not a, that's kind of a leap. And then you read certain prophecies that are quoted in the New Testament, and you can't find them in your current edition of the Old Testament. Well, there's two reasons for that. One, the translation issue I was just talking about, but two, canon. So with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see uh, how things were translated before Christ, and it turns out like, okay, there's that quote that was in the New Testament, quoted as a prophecy, but we couldn't find it in our Old Testament. It's because it was translated wrong, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have the same translation. And then also canon. When you see the book of Jude, the epistle of Jude, Jude, where he quotes First Enoch right in the beginning. We don't have First Enoch in our canons, but the first Christians were reading that. The Pharisees were not reading it. The Sadducees definitely weren't, because they were only reading 5 books of Moses. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, the Qumran community, the Essenes, all the same group, they were reading Enoch. And they had a bunch of other writings. And again, they had an active prophetic school. And none of the other sects did. So this is why Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship is so important to Christianity right now, and I guarantee you, the face of Christianity, even Catholicism, is changing, and it's going to be changed more as scholarship continues and starts to understand this stuff more, because there's a gap of knowledge for a long time between the church fathers, what they said, especially Justin Martyr, what they said about the Jewish groups before Christ, and as well as the church. There's a gap between that and like our body of scripture writings, and as the university system became more important, as the scientific method came in, people were like, I don't know if we have enough primary sources to really corroborate this hearsay of what the church fathers were saying. Well, the point is, now we do. We have primary sources. We have proof of what the scriptures really looked like before Christ. A big one that we have is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a copy of Daniel 9 that has these same times, about the 70 weeks and all this stuff, that point to when Messiah would come. People used to think that that was a Christian forgery because it was so dead on about when Messiah would come. People used to claim, oh, the prophecies of Daniel were forged by Christians because it just so conveniently points to the first century, and the time when the Roman Empire would be in control, and when a figure like Herod would be king, and its relationship to the time when the temple fell, the second temple fell. Nope, wasn't a forgery. Dead Sea Scrolls prove it. Daniel was untouched. It reads exactly the way the early Christians claimed it read, and the way our most of our Bibles based on the Septuagint say it read. And the copy that we have from Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, is like 200 years before Christ. So that's why all this stuff matters. Again, the topic was, did Paul found Christianity? No, he did not. It's a reaction to a video by Elon Gilad. If you want to, you can check it out. I'll put the link in the description. Anyway, I'm going to go do some homeschooling, help out my wife, continue drinking coffee until I can eat at 4 p.m. because I'm intermittent fasting. Let me know if you ever do that. It's amazing. Although I don't know what I'm going to do for Lent now because I'm already fasting. Let me know if you have any ideas. All right, guys, God bless you. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know your comments and questions. Sign up for my Substack mailing list for 2 reasons. One, there's exclusive content there if you're paid. But 2, even if you don't want the paid tier, it's how I stay in touch now. I got off of Facebook and Instagram, so I'm a little harder to reach, and I like it that way. But that mailing list, you can respond directly into my inbox, and I'm down to correspond while the volume is manageable. Thanks, guys. God bless you.